Can everybody see that? Yes? Okay. Tashilele, everyone. It is so good to be here. It's been an exciting series so far, and Robin and I are very excited to talk a little bit about a new direction that the program is heading in. And we're going to really focus on sort of how we want to integrate more authentic original research into the ETSI training model. So you'll notice on this slide that we've put our email addresses there, and that's for a very important reason. Really, we see these workshops as an opportunity to connect with everybody, even though we're scattered all over the world and the program's been delayed a little bit because we cannot travel. We think that a lot of what we're talking about today in terms of just building the seeds of research can start at any time. It can start now, and we can facilitate that. So please reach out to us, write down our names and email addresses. We'll put them in the chat as well. They're on the last slide as well. But please, if you have ideas or thoughts or things that we can help with, let us know. All right, so the first thing we'd like to do is just to get to know a little bit about who is here. So if in the chat you can type your name and list where you are now, whatever part of the world or what monastery you're at or where your apartment is. If you're one of the Emory students, that would be great. So while we continue to do that, it's always, I think this is one really nice way to highlight in each of these workshops that we're a community of people. We're all here together today, even though we're spread far apart. And we're so glad that we were able to do this. So a little bit about myself. I am a faculty member in the Department of Biology at Emory University. I first taught in the ETSI program in 2016, introductory biology, and then had the opportunity to participate in a research workshop that we'll talk a little bit about today. I have two small children, one of whom is shown in this picture. This is Zoe, and she may show up in this room at some point because she's taking school downstairs. Sorry, my computer is being difficult. So I am here today in part because I grew up next to these beautiful mountains. Like many of you grew up near beautiful mountains. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is in the high elevation desert of the United States. And this is actually a picture taken from my high school. In the 7th grade, so when I was very young, that's when you're about 7th grade, you're like 12 or something, I had an amazing biology teacher. And I always wanted to be like her. I wanted to be a biologist for a long time, and here I am today. And I think this really highlights that one strength of this program is that we are hopefully engaging people so that they'll become better teachers of science and practitioners of science. And that's really sort of what builds a scientist. That's what gets people excited about science and makes them participate and want to learn more. Robin?
So can you hear me? Yep, okay. So Teshidale, it's so good to see everyone. My name is Robin Nusslock. I'm a professor at Northwestern University, which you can see you see my cursor moving? Oh, you probably can't see my cursor moving. So it's right, because you're controlling it, Nicole. Theory of mind exercise. I'm in that big star right in the middle of the United States in Chicago, Illinois. And I'm a professor at Northwestern University. I'm in psychology and neuroscience. And I'm very interested in how the brain creates emotion and thoughts. We use the tools of MRI technology to study the structure and function of the brain and how that creates your thoughts and emotions. Next slide. So this was one of the most transformative moments of my life, this picture here. When I was a sophomore in college, I was a philosophy and Buddhist studies major, and I needed some extra money for my summer just to create some cash. And so I got a job, randomly got a job scrubbing electrodes in a neuroscience laboratory. And you may recognize the person right behind His Holiness. That's Richard Davidson, who has done a lot of the pioneering work on neuroscience and meditation. And so I just happened to get a job in Richie's laboratory scrubbing electrodes. And then, like on my second or third day there, I hear all of this rustling out in the hallway, and the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, is walking down the hallway with National Geographic for what was to become the cover episode for National Geographic on the science of mind. And so there was like a 4-day meeting at the University of Wisconsin where I was an undergraduate, and I just kind of like snuck in the back room and you know, followed people around for 4 days. And I walked out of that meeting and switched my major to psychology and neuroscience and did my undergraduate in Richie's laboratory, and ended up doing my PhD in neuroscience in Richie's laboratory. And so I'd like to say that you all brought me to the study of science. The study of Buddhism and the study of mind actually brought me to the investigation of science. And so one of the themes for our conversation today will be the rich intersection of science and Buddhism, and how they really are this kind of synergistic or collaborative thing. And so it was Buddhism that brought me to science, and it's one of the many reasons I'm so grateful to be a part of ETSI, and because in a sense it feels like a homecoming to be able to come and teach and learn from all of you. So that's me. So what we want to do is, first of all, we want to orient you a bit to where we are today. You've listened to some wonderful conversations on pedagogy, on physics, on biology, on neuroscience. And today what we're going to be doing is taking a little bit of a break before we get to philosophy of science and Buddhism and science. And we're going to be switching the lens a little bit to not just learning about science, but discussing what it means to actually do science. And an important goal of this next phase, the sustainability phase of ETSI, will be to help make the transition from being consumers of science to helping you actually generate science, because the world wants to hear the questions that you have to ask. There's this wonderful kind of dance between learning science and doing science. And so the picture on the left here is a picture from ETSI in which you're learning science, and the picture on the right is a picture in which you're doing science. And the real core component of the research training program of the sustainability portion of ETSI will be to help you become scientists, and ideally start your own projects and work on your own projects with very close collaboration from the ETSI faculty. And we're all very committed to helping you, do this if this is something that you're interested in. So today's class, or today's conversation, will really be a description and an overview of the research training program for this particular sustainability phase of ETSI. Okay, next slide. So what I wanted to do to begin this little portion here is to actually discuss some of the very exciting science that's happening in neuroscience at the moment. And again, to kind of bring it home to the fact that the questions that you all are exploring questions of consciousness, questions of compassion, questions of mind, questions of thought, emotion, are really at the frontier or a very central portion right now of the neuroscientific field. And there's a whole field called contemplative neuroscience at the moment that's really driven by questions of how the mind and how the brain creates things like compassion and empathy and various forms of thought. This initiative really began at a meeting that Richie Davidson had with His Holiness in the 90s, in which he was in Dharamsala and he was meeting with His Holiness, and His Holiness said, you know, you have all these wonderful tools in neuroscience to study the mind, but why do you focus on fear or anxiety or depression or, you know, anger? Why don't you start to focus more on positive emotions like compassion or empathy? And that really initiated a switch in neuroscience to not just focus on what's wrong with the brain in certain states, but what's right with the brain. And you are all teaching us a lot about what's right with the brain. So we wanted to give you just a brief update of some of the research on neuroscience and meditation, just to kind of show you the types of questions that you could all do yourselves with the tools that hopefully will provide you over the next few years. And so this is a picture of Mingyur Rinpoche. Mingyur Rinpoche is a part of the Kagyu tradition. He's somebody that I've been studying pretty closely with. He's a part of the leader of the Turgar community. And this is actually a picture of Mingyur Rinpoche in which we put an EEG cap on him. This was in Richie Davidson's laboratory, and studied his brain waves while he was engaging in meditation versus not engaging in meditation. And Mingyur Rinpoche has spent many, many years in meditation and really is kind of an Olympic athlete of the mind, just in terms of his ability to work with the mind. And what you see here on the bottom is this is a recording of Mingyur Rinpoche's brain from this little set of electrodes that are on his scalp here. And you'll see that at the beginning of this recording, the lines are fairly narrow. They're fairly, you know, kind of thin. And that's when Mingyur Rinpoche is just in a relaxed state. He's not meditating, he's not doing meditation. But then you'll notice that the lines all of a sudden get thicker. And that's actually when Mingyur Rinpoche starts to meditate. And so the first point that we want to make here is that meditation, there's really wonderful research to suggest, can change your brain. That the act of really doing the exercises that you have all devoted your life to, that you are really, you know, kind of at the heart of this, of these exercises and traditions and paths and all of this, really do have robust effects on the mind and the brain, and that we have the ability to investigate this with the tools of current neuroscience. And the next figure just shows you an increase in the voltage in Mingyur Rinpoche's brain, where he's moving from, some of you may have heard, kind of alpha and beta states to more gamma states, which is really a high frequency in the brain. So the next slide. Another thing that we want to show you is that not only can meditation and all of the practices that we're learning from you, we're really beginners here in the West in terms of learning this incredible tradition of practices from you. It's been shown that this also changes brain structure. So people who go through or really devote a lot of their life to practice of contemplation and meditation and these various practices have been shown to not only change the function of the brain, but to actually change the structure of the brain. So this is a study in which they studied the effects of long-term meditators, so people who had really spent a lot of their life practicing meditation. And they looked at an area or a mechanism in the brain called white matter. Now, from neuroscience courses at ETSI, some of you may know what white matter is. There's a picture of white matter on the side here. And Nicole, do we have that video? Might you be able to show that? I've got a fun video for you that shows kind of a tour of the brain through white matter. And I'll tell you what white matter is in just a second.
Can you see it?
So now we're going to go inside the brain. And that's the corpus callosum, that big band in the middle that connects our hemispheres. And now we're coming back out. Perfect. Thank you, Nicole. So using the tools of MRI, which you see an MRI machine right there in the corner. This is a, has anyone had an MRI machine? You could kind of raise your hand or been in an MRI. It's kind of an interesting experience where you're put into this tube and you, thank you, Dorji. I see Dorji's had an MRI. Jacob's had an MRI. I can't see many of the rest of you, but some of you have had an MRI. So we can actually go in and look at the structure of the brain and create these renderings of the brain. And what they find is that people who meditate for long periods of time actually change these white matter pathways. And just very briefly, white matter in the brain, you could think of as like the highways of the brain. They're the connections. They're the portions of the brain that communicate with each other. It's the wiring of the brain. So it's really a way of adjusting and altering the wiring of the brain. Next slide, Nicole. In the last slide that we just want to show you on actual research is the benefits of meditation and these contemplative practices, not only for people who devote their whole life to meditation, but also people who are just new to meditation in these contemplative practices that, again, we're really learning from you. You are the gift givers, in a sense, of this particular set of exercises and traditions and paths that we're all learning from you. Even people who go just through an 8-week course, learning these techniques, learning these practices, show structural changes in the brain. You may have learned about an area of the brain called the hippocampus in our neuroscience classes in ETSI. Does anyone know what the hippocampus is? You could just enter it into the chat if you know what the hippocampus is involved in, what psychological or mental process the hippocampus is involved in, which is this little purple thing. Yes, Ten Palber says memory. Jampa says memory. Hippocampus stores memory. Good. So you learned some good facts in neuroscience. Gaelic memory. So what the hippocampus is involved is it's involved in storing memory. And what you can see in this figure, just you can't see my cursor here, but you'll notice that maybe Nicole, you can just kind of point to the controls. You'll notice that these are participants who did not go through the meditation training. So these are people who are kind of a control baseline group. And then the red bar are people who went through a mindfulness-based stress reduction program with a teacher named John Kabat-Zinn, who was involved in teaching them how to do meditation. Now in this kind of vertical, the numbers here correspond to changes in the size of the hippocampus. So the actual size of the hippocampus. And it's important that it says change because we're actually looking at changes in the hippocampus before and after people go through meditation. And what you can see here is just going through an 8-week course on meditation helps people change their brains and change in particular the volume of the hippocampus. So what we want to do in the research training portion of this class, and I'll mention this a little bit later, is, we've kind of been studying meditation from the West. We'd like to learn what questions you have to ask about the mind, about consciousness, about the brain, about meditation, about contemplative practices. We want to put the ball in your court and say, help us, let's collaborate and work as a group and work as a team to do research. And so the goal of the research training portion of ETSI is to really help develop the skills so that you can start to ask questions that interest you about mind, about reality, about ecology, about nature, about etc. So that was our just little brief tour of some of the fun things that we can learn from research. Oop, I think you're muted, Nicole.
And really, this idea of a research mindset is the idea of that, you know, science isn't just like a way we think about the world. It's a process, and it's really definitely more than just a set of facts. So the initial stages of the ETSI program, even in those initial classes, in the introductory classes that many of you took, we tried to get you just observing the world around you as much as possible and starting to ask questions and start to think about how you would answer those questions. And so the idea is to help you sort of build a tool set and build the knowledge and build the confidence to start being a scientist and feel comfortable being a scientist. So we just want to get people thinking a little bit about what research is. And there are many answers to that question. And then make sure that, you know, we all have some understanding of what a hypothesis is. So what we're going to do is we'll go into breakout rooms for about 5 minutes, and we'll have you in those breakouts with whoever you're with to discuss these two questions. What is research and what is a hypothesis? Take the opportunity to maybe write down some answers, and then we'll call out to groups when we come back to hear people's answers to these two questions. So we wanted to briefly sort of collect some of people's ideas of what research is. So can somebody who is in one of the breakout rooms provide a definition that the group came up with?
Shall I start?
That would be wonderful.
Okay, so our group just discussed about, or we came down to defining research as a way of finding whether the hypothesis is right or wrong.
What is another definition?
Okay, can I say something?
Yes.
Okay, from our group, as majority agree, like the research is you finding some answer what you wanted to know through like scientific method.
And I think that in our group, we also we had definitions that included the scientific method. So having a question that you want to address, and you might address it through the scientific question, but we also talked about a historian, somebody who studies history might also do research, right? So that there are sort of research methods across many disciplines that are based on saying, what knowledge do we know now? What is our question? And what methods are we going to use to address that question? Did we have any more definitions? So one of these definitions uses the word hypothesis. So what is a hypothesis?
So it may be the well-informed possible solution of the problem.
Did you say one possible solution?
Well-informed.
Informed.
Possible solution of the problem.
And how do we gather that information? What is that information based on?
This is like pre-existing knowledge.
Yeah, pre-existing knowledge, previous research. There's no way that a student in my lab can't start their graduate work without knowing what work came before them. And you don't want to necessarily assume all of that's right. You may need to test that pre-existing knowledge, but you do, science builds on itself. We don't start from a blank slate. Any other ideas about a hypothesis?
Madam, it's an educated guess. Educated guess, ma'am.
Yep, educated guess. Again, that education is about knowing sort of existing understanding of the problem or the question related work, and then using that to sort of form what you expect. And then we test that hypothesis, and we don't necessarily figure out if that hypothesis is right or wrong. We tend to say the hypothesis is supportive, the data is consistent with the hypothesis, or the hypothesis is not supportive. You might do another experiment and say like, oh, this shows us something different. So oftentimes we would say the hypothesis is supported or not supported when doing research. All right, those are some great definitions. Robin, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah.
Well, anyone else? I heard somebody's.
Okay. In my opinion, like hypothesis is kind of theoretical answers to your questions prior, like pre-research or like pre-collecting the data. So it's like,
Yeah, I just would say that related to what was just said, the word that I think of when I think of hypothesis is prediction. That it's really, you're using the knowledge that you have to make a prediction. So I think that's perfect. The prior answers to your questions is a great way of saying that. Because really what science and research is interested in doing is predicting future things, right? Can you use your knowledge now to predict what might happen in the future? That future could be a millisecond away or 100 years away. So.
Great, those were great answers.
Those are great answers. So one of the things that we wanted to do next was appreciate that research and science is really more about a mindset, and we've talked a little bit about this, than it is about techniques. It's about a way of looking at the world. It's a view of the world. It's an approach to understanding the experiences that we have in our life, the things that we see. It's a way of investigating the nature of reality, the scientific method. And so Buddhism has a lot of those similar qualities. And so we wanted to ask the question to you, and maybe if you have a piece of paper, we could take a few moments right now and just think and maybe write down some thoughts about the following question. What are the similarities and differences between Buddhism and research? And you could say Buddhism and science. It doesn't need to be research, but what are the similarities? So I would write down what are the similarities that you see, but also what might be the differences between what you know about research and all the experience you have with Buddhism. So why don't we take a few moments or a few minutes and give some thought to that, write down some thoughts, and then we can have a conversation. Maybe Nicole, for this, we want to close the slides and do gallery view just so we can see each other. Okay, so if you on your Zoom, if you go to view and you go to gallery, it allows us to see all of each other, or at least many of us, rather than so. I'd just like to ask the question now, having had some time to think about what is the difference and similarities between Buddhism and science. Love it if people have thoughts on this and we could have a little bit of a conversation on this. Let's maybe start with the similarities. Anyone have any ideas of what the similarity is between Buddhism and science, or Buddhism and research? You can just unmute yourself and go ahead and speak. Tenzin Jiangchu? When I think you're muted. Yeah.
So the similarities between Buddhism and research or science is that, like Buddha's teaching, it says that do not accept my words just because that I'm a Buddha, but try to experiment it. And if you find it logical, then you can implement it. So it is same as it's same like Western science, in which it is based on analysis, and it's a body of knowledge which is based on analysis and through empirical evidence. So I think this is one of the similarities between Buddhism and research.
Perfection. What a wonderful response. So both are an investigation of reality and don't accept it just because somebody says it. Perfect. Any other ideas on the similarities between Buddhism and science, or Buddhism and research? So I think Tenzin Jiangchu, is that how I pronounce your name? Yeah. I think
Okay,
said
I want to jump in.
Dadu, yes.
Yes, I think the purpose behind doing science, and we may call doing Buddhism, is the same, aiming at easing the life, easing one's life, making something more efficient, more close to the reality, relieving suffering, however way one may understand suffering.
Yeah, can I add one thing? I think it's one way is the searching for truth is systematic and comprehensive. I think both have own kind of systematic, not only random.
Beautiful. Who else wants to say something? You can just unmute yourself and speak. Yes, Rangdo.
Okay, I would like to say that in Buddhism we will say definition of listener. So in terms of research, I use it as a researcher. So you have to have the 3 qualities to listener as a Buddhist. So if you are a good listener, then you have to have a good unbiased, one quality. And also other one is sharp-minded, and the other one is you have to have interest in that topic. So these 3 are, I think, I can use it as a researcher quality.
Wonderful. Any other thoughts or comments on the similarities between Buddhism?
One more thing. I think like just as in research, we have to do lots of literature survey before beginning our own research. And Buddhism also, before your own practice, you have to do lots of literature review from the previous commentaries and previous texts. So there is a similarity in that context.
I totally agree.
So if I may add my opinion, so in my point of view, like Buddhism and science both chest and curiosity that we have tried to find like answers to our questions, but on different basis. Like for Buddhism, like most of the answers that we find in Buddhism is like mostly based on the philosophical way, like using logic. And in science, like we try to find the answers through research. That's it.
So yeah, there's a real logic to both the Buddhist investigation and the scientific investigation, isn't there? There's this kind of, I think this really Stanzen Wangdan makes an important point on the idea that this is really a mindset, right? It's not just about, it's not a set of facts. The scientific investigation and the Buddhist investigation are more about consciousness, ways of viewing and approaching reality. And I love that perspective of there being a logical organization to both the scientific and the Buddhist investigation of reality. Anyone else want to talk about the similarities?
I think both Buddhism and science involve finding if there's any loophole in the previous idea.
Ah, wonderful. Can you say a little bit more, Tenzin Sonam?
So the previous, for instance, in science, if there's any discovery made by a previous scientist, so in the next generation or then later, the same, I mean, the scientist who is doing research in the same field, first they try to find if there's any caveat or if there's some ambiguity in the previous research, and or try to correct it and to make it incrementally improvement.
I love that idea of an incremental improvement, right? So in science in particular, there's this sense of small steps. There's very few Einsteins in the world who come and just totally reorganize the entire scientific view overnight. You know, Albert Einstein did that with his theory of special relativity. Certain advancements in quantum physics that you might have learned about the probabilistic nature of electrons and kind of the very, very micro scale of reality really changed the world overnight. But most of what we do in science is very, very small steps. They're little small kind of incremental steps forward. It's a very long investigation and a long journey. Any final thoughts on the similarities between science and Buddhism? Okay, so if I could just summarize, I took some notes of your ideas, and if I could just summarize briefly some of the ideas that came up. So it's not in any particular order. So the one idea that came up is that both science and Buddhism are about investigating reality, which I think is a really important idea. So they're both curious about the nature of reality. There's this sense of don't accept things just because you're told by an authority or because you're told in a book. You need to go out and investigate it yourself. That there's a sense of you're your own investigator. There's a search for truth. There's a listening component. I loved the idea of a listener, and the listener, to be a good listener in Buddhism, I think is similar to being a good scientist, which is that there's a sense of being unbiased. You have a sharp mind and you're interested. There's a sense of the importance of being prepared, that you prepare, you do the groundwork so that you can do the kind of more deeper scientific investigations, but you have to do this in stages. There's a logical component to it, where both the scientific investigation and the Buddhist investigation is a logical kind of set of steps that you move towards to investigate reality. And I just want to finish with Geshe Dadu's very important point, which is that ultimately these are both exercises that are about embettering the world, right? Science has made great advancements in alleviating suffering in the world in terms of physical health and survival and diseases, and Buddhism has made hugely important contributions to compassion and empathy and service. So what a wonderful conversation. Let's take a moment, if you would, to just discuss what are the differences between science and Buddhism? What stands out as a difference for you? And maybe if you presumably wrote a few things down or took some notes. So if you have any ideas, you can just unmute yourself and voice your thoughts.
Okay, can I say something?
Please, Shayan.
Yeah, so the difference is usually we differentiate the Buddhism in three parts, right? The Buddhist religion, and then Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist science. So I think the Buddhist religion is the biggest difference between science and Buddhism, because it's based on more like faith and really like a religious system. So I think in science this stuff is we cannot find in the science, so that's why this is the biggest differences.
Beautiful, thank you. Other ideas of the differences between science and Buddhism? So Shayan really touched on the idea of there being a faith component to Buddhism that you probably don't see in science.
Maybe, I think a concern of ethics, maybe, because in research-wise, we do a lot of works on animals, right? And which is totally against in Buddhism, where we practice compassion and empathy sort of thing. And we are not totally, but we're against harm to animals. So in that terms, maybe. But these days we are working on ethics, especially in science. So in future, maybe.
That's such a great point. And I may even add to that, some of science is not driven by ethics, it's purely driven by curiosity. So, some of the investigation, some of the breakthroughs in science, the driving force wasn't necessarily ethical, it was just purely curious. And sometimes science is used for great purposes, and sometimes it can really be used for bad purposes. There's sometimes a history of that. So I think you point out a really important point, which Buddhism starts with that ethical consideration. And I think at times science is purely about the investigation, and then it's kind of up to people to hopefully use those insights in an ethical way. Other thoughts on the differences?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think one of the difference is the science is mainly based on the experiment, and Buddhism is lots of tests to do with the logics. So, and also the experiment, even though Buddhism, we are taking maybe experiment, we call it more like personal, not public. In scientific experiment, it has to be, public, or many people or at least other researchers can prove it later.
Such an important point.
Yeah, and also that the big thing is the science has to be value-free, or whether it's a non-judgmental, some sort of, whether this kind of result, anyway, there's almost like no direction. The Buddhism has to be goal to, as Geshe Damdula mentioned, it has to be elevation of the suffering or something, ethical judgment.
Such important points.
Yeah.
Any other final thoughts on the differences between?
Can I add something?
Can I add something?
Please. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
How about Gaelic and then Tenzin Rabaka?
I think in our tradition, in our classes here, so we talk a lot about, previous life and next life. But, I didn't hear anything about that in the classes, the Western, when I took the classes, Emory, they don't talk about, a lot about the previous life, next life. So there's very big differences.
Absolutely. Thank you. A very important point. Tenzin Rabaka?
Well, now can I add something?
Yes, please.
Sorry. So I have two things in mind. And the first one is that even though Buddhism and scientific research both rely on finding the nature of reality, but the way to find the reality, I think there's some difference in that, because in Buddhism, mostly the way of finding is through meditation or like through critical thinking, mostly through mentally. Whether you could use the term thought experiment or like that, I don't know, but mostly it's through mentally, and scientific research is done mostly on through hand-on activities like that. And also the main subject of finding the reality is different, I think, because from the Buddhist perspective, the main purpose is to be free from all the suffering. While from scientific research or while from the Western scientific point of view, the main purpose is to find find the reality itself. They don't have no main idea of being free from suffering like that. It's not backed by that. So these are some differences that I found.
So important. Thank you.
So I like to add another point.
Sure.
So I think the part of that has already been said. I think the wording may be different. So Western scientific research is mainly aspiration for knowledge, according to data and more and more knowledge. So it doesn't have a direction. It goes outward towards everything to collect more data and produce more materials, everything. But whereas these religions, all of them are unidirectional. There is a direction behind that. There is caring for more values, and as somebody also said about ethics and everything. So the direction is one of the things.
Yes.
May I jump in?
Sure.
Yeah, but currently the science is very much involved in looking for solution, looking for some cure for pandemic. So sometimes it does have a direction, it does have a goal to start with, and then does it best, and then luckily we may find some outcome, some positive outcome also.
So let me just summarize so we can keep moving along. So just some of the differences again in just the order that I wrote them down. So there's the idea of faith in Buddhism. Shoyan mentioned there was 3 pillars of Buddhism: religion, philosophy, and science. And so maybe the scientific portion of Buddhism aligns with Western science, but maybe there's other components of Buddhism, particularly in the faith domain, that's slightly different. There was the important issue of ethics. Ethics came up in multiple different ways. One was, how science uses animals for research, but also ethics came up also in a number of points about what's the intention of the research mission versus the intention of the Buddhist path. The intention of research is in some respects more exploratory, maybe undirected, just to investigate the fabric of reality. Whereas the sense of Buddhism is that there's this kind of initial and constant intention of alleviating suffering, of helping others. Gaelic mentioned the idea of even facilitating reincarnation and helping the path in the next life. And so some science sometimes is purely investigation in the now, whereas Buddhism has a bit more of a long-term perspective. There was, I think, a really, really interesting point that I had not thought much about, but that you've taught me about today, which is this difference is between the public and the personal. Science is a bit more of a public enterprise, where Buddhism and meditation is a very personal enterprise. And related to that, there's a kind of a scientific method, whereas the methods of Buddhism can be often about the own mind investigating its own self. There's a more intimacy, maybe a more personal investigation rather than the depersonalized component that you often see in science. And let's see what else. And, you know, I think that Gerardo did mention something very interesting, that is that science can at times be really focused on alleviating suffering. For example, some of the research on the vaccines for the pandemics, and other times it can be just purely investigative. So what a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much on the similarities and differences between science and Buddhism. I think there's a lot of shared ground that we have, and that's why this collaboration is so exciting. A lot of similarities. Okay.
There are some comments in the chat.
Oh,
if
okay.
you would like to.
I think for now we're gonna probably keep moving, and then if we have some extra time at the end, we can return to the chat comments. So what we want to do now is we want to do a little bit of a bit more concrete conversation about the actual goals of the sustainability phase of the research program. And the first goal that we have is something that we've now already been discussing, which is that both science and Buddhism are about curiosity, right? They're about being curious about the fabric of reality, about the nature of reality. They're an investigation into the nature of reality. And so I think I speak for Nicole and myself when we say that one of the primary goals that we have in the research training portion of the sustainability phase of ETSI is to fuel the fire of curiosity and show how science, like Buddhism, can be a really exciting endeavor of investigating reality. Some people think of science as kind of like a set of scary tools or techniques or mathematical equations. Those are just techniques to investigate what makes us curious. And I always think of this quote by Richard Feynman, who's a theoretical physicist. He won the Nobel Prize in physics. And he says it has to do with, he's talking about science. Science has to do with curiosity. It has to do with people wondering what makes something do something. What we are looking for is how everything works. What makes everything work. I think this quote really captures the curiosity of science, but I think it also captures the differences of science and Buddhism that some of you mentioned, where Buddhism may have the intention more about alleviating suffering and compassion, whereas here we see science as in kind of, in a sense, value-free of really just investigating reality. But I think the two can really combine in a powerful way. So then the next goal that we have in the research training portion is to teach some technical skills and to really help you develop some skills to have this curiosity and investigate curiosity, to investigate what interests you. Again, we use the idea that research is really me-search. What interests you is what you can study and research. And one of the goals that we have is to teach you some skills to actually do that investigation, to use those particular tools. Next slide. We next want to focus on guiding research development in your training. So one of the things that we'll do in guiding research development is helping you develop research projects. So during the early stages of the sustainability phase, we'll probably work together in developing projects and even developing questions, because as we discussed, it's important to kind of do this in stages. We don't want to just throw you right into the deep end and say, all right, go do a study on brain activity or a study on ecology. We want to help kind of guide you along so that you gain some familiarity and some knowledge of research, and also that you gain some knowledge about how to come up with a scientific question, how to investigate that technically, how to analyze the data. So during the early stages, we'll be guiding the research development. Next one. And then this last point really relates to one of the goals that we have during the sustainability phase, is to take seriously this idea that research is really a mindset. So while teaching technical skills is important, and teaching how to, you know, build certain equipments or do certain math equations, or, you know, graph certain data are important, research is ultimately, and science is ultimately about a state of consciousness. How to investigate a question using the scientific method. And so we'll spend some time on topics like experimental design, hypothesis testing. What does it mean to test a hypothesis? What does it mean to design a study and implement it and collect data and then analyze those data? How do you present those data for publication or presentation? How do you interpret data? We'll be talking about that. How do you go off and present the results of a scientific finding or research project to other people? So we really want to, in addition to teaching you the skills, teach you kind of how to investigate these questions from a science and research mindset. So there are really three phases of the ETSI program. The first is phase 1, where we'll introduce you to the scientific method and experimental design. We'll do some training in cognitive neuroscience. The cognitive neuroscience will be one of the focuses at the beginning of this of the research endeavor. We'll do a team project. Most likely that team project will revolve around sleep, because that's going to be a topic of research that I think will be very exciting for people to look into, and we can help. You know, it's something that you can also do on your own, and take notes on your own and investigate on your own, and we'll go through some data collection and organization. So this is the phase 1, and just to give you a sense that at the beginning, we'll be doing a fair amount of focus on cognitive neuroscience, and I'm actually going to purchase a bunch of EEG equipment for ETSI and bring that over to India, and we're going to set up some EEG instruments. So the EEG is a technique that for studying brain activity. You can see here on the slide, this blue cap is an EEG system, and EEG is a way of actually studying the activity of the brain, and we'll teach you how to do this. We'll teach you how to actually study brain activity, and one of the reasons we want to focus on this is because this is a really good technique for studying the mind, and it's a good technique for studying meditation. And so you'll get some exposure to studying EEG, and you can see on the right panel here, those little squiggly lines are the output of an EEG system and for studying brain activity. So you'll get a sense of how to do EEG. And again, so this is Nicole.
So, you know, when you see the EEG machine, it does sort of bring up this idea of, oh, there's all these technical skills I don't know, and I'm not a scientist. But really the first and most important part of science is just sort of observing the world around you and asking a question about it. So here is my question. I noticed the last time that I was at Sarah May that it seemed like the monastics were awake all the time. I'd wake up in the morning and I would hear chanting. At night, when we were finally ready for our class the next day and finally going to bed, I could still hear chanting. And so my question is, who gets more sleep? Monastics at the monasteries or Emory College students? And I know that all of you have gone to a ceremony and seen your fellow monks and nuns who might be falling asleep just a little bit. And I've certainly seen college students falling asleep in classes. So very quickly, we want to have you sort of get in breakout rooms for about 4 minutes and just be like, what is a hypothesis? So we talked about, you know, it's a prediction based on prior knowledge. So you need to make about a hypothesis of who you think gets more sleep, monastics or Emory College students. And then how would you do an experiment? What data do we need to collect to test this hypothesis? So let's go ahead and get out breakout rooms and just come up with the hypothesis that you're going to test and what data we need to collect. And we'll give you about 4 minutes. Hopefully most people are back. Is that true?
I think everyone is back. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so just to sort of sum up what our group did, because we don't have time to get sort of information from other groups, there's really sort of 3 possible hypotheses, and we, using our prior knowledge, we sort of lean towards one hypothesis or the other, probably most likely. So one hypothesis using prior knowledge is that monastics get less sleep than college students. Just having been a college, some of us in our group have been a college student and then been at the monasteries, and just our impression is that it seems like the monastics are awake all the time. Then the other hypothesis that was quite interesting is because college students are under a lot of stress and maybe don't have the same tools of meditation to help with that stress, that could impact their sleep and they would get less sleep overall. So the data that we need to collect, the primary data we need to collect, is how much sleep both monastics and students are getting. So here you should be seeing a data sheet, and you see data from 20 Emory college students. These are all first-year students in introductory biology, and they were willing to tell us how many hours they slept last night. So what we want to do now is, now we have data from one group, we have data from college students, and we need to get some data from some monastics to start answering that question. And so in the chat, there will be a link to this sheet, and I'm going to show you how to enter the data. Or if the link doesn't work for you, you can put it in the chat and we'll try to add data. And we're going to try to get data from at least 10 people. But I'm going to add right now, I'm going to add information from one person. Calden, are you on the call? He was here earlier.
Sorry.
Hi, okay, Calden, we're going to record your information. So I'm going to, oops. So here's Calden. How many hours did you sleep last night, Calden?
Oh, last night, around six
Okay.
hours.
Yes, you're a Buddhist monastic. Now, Colin's interesting because he's also an Emory student right now. So I'm going to put yes for both of those. Some of you might put yes for both. But go ahead, and if you can get to the spreadsheet, go ahead and find a row for yourself. And then enter those 4 things: your name, how many hours you slept last night, whether you're a monastic, and whether you're an Emory student.
We have some who are both.
You are both, you can say both. And if you're neither, you can say no to both. So if I was going to put this, I would have to put no to both.
Oh, somebody wrote numbers, not my one. My one is not.
Do they need to include the afternoon nap hours?
Oh, see, so this is why science is so complicated.
Yeah, they do.
You start thinking about, oh, well, does that count or not? Really, right now, we're just going to simplify it and ask about the numbers of hours you slept during the night straight through. Because we could go into the prior literature and find like that amount of time when you really get into that deep sleep is very important for sort of your brain and reorganization. So maybe we're just focusing on that. But in our group, we also talked about the fact that we might want to collect other information. Do you have a meditation practice? Questions that would allow us to understand the amount of stress you're under. Maybe it would be better to collect data not from just one night, but like, weeks worth of data. Because maybe, last night, maybe Calden normally gets 2 hours. And for whatever reason, he decided to get 6 last night. So we might want to capture more information. But right now, this is what we need. So let's see.
I think the monastery has a fixed schedule. Yeah, they have proper timing for whatever they do. But in a college life, oh my God, this baby! I'm sorry, that's neighbor's baby.
No worries.
Anyhow, but in a college level, I think you do have certain free time, right? Like there's no continuous class. There's certain break, and people like students do part-time job in those time as well, or like they do have a lot of more available hours than a monastic monk, I feel. So maybe this data could make some difference in the process, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. So what we might expect is if the monasteries are on very fixed schedules, that we might hypothesize that the monks in general would have very similar amounts of sleep. And whereas with the college undergraduates, we might see lots of variation for those that stayed up late that night to work on a history paper, and then they catch up and get a lot of sleep the next day and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what. So the variability would be more in a college student compared to the monastery one.
Right. And certainly the more data we collect, the more we can answer that. So just because we're running out of time, I'm going to show you it's starting to average here, sort of. This is actually not quite accurate because we have some people who are not monastics who are answering below, but I wanted to set up ahead of time. But overall, you know, we're not seeing any clear difference between that group of Emory students who answered the survey before and the group of individuals who are filling out the survey now, right? So the group of students, the Emory students who I listed as not monastics here, they're sleeping like about 6.5 hours a night on average, as is everybody else on this call. Now, I have another hypothesis.
Look at that standard deviation, Nicole.
What?
Look at the difference in the standard deviation.
Yeah, it's true. So you'll notice that for the Emory students, who I listed as not monastic here, the standard deviation means that there's lots of variation. So that hypothesis is they're not on a set schedule. You had the history paper last night, but somebody else didn't. And if you look at the Emory students, look, there's one Emory student who said they got 1 hour of sleep last night, right? So that's the, I'm just going to study as hard as I can for this exam or get this paper done. What's very interesting about the Emory student data as well is I hypothesize that this data is very different than it would be in a non-COVID year. Because in a non-COVID year, Emory students start doing all kinds of different things all the time, and they're pulled in a million directions. And I think that starts to increase that variation even more. And by this point in the semester, they're just not getting much sleep. So I think some of these students are actually getting more sleep than they will a year from now. But what we were able to do in a very short amount of time, even in a world where we can't be together and have an EEG, is just start to ask a question. And this simple question then could get us to draw, you know, say like, well, is it the same quality of sleep? Is the sleep, the amount of variation due to sort of certain practices? Like you just start generating more and more questions, and that is at the heart of science. And that is something that everybody on this call can start doing. Even if you can't be together, you can start thinking about what are questions we want to ask and how can we do this? How can we survey people and get information, you know, even when we're not together. So Robin, do you want to just talk a bit about phase 2?
In three seconds, I'll just say that during phase 2, we'll continue opportunities for training in cognitive neuroscience if you want. And actually, there is the opportunity to get some training in MRI scanning. It looks as though I may be able to get access to an MRI machine in Goa, so in which we could actually do some training on MRI. Even if we can't collect data, we could still show you how to look at MRI images and analyze a little bit of MRI data at the monasteries or nunneries. But the point here is that at phase 2, we'll just continue more advanced training and give you more opportunities to dive in.
We're also phase 2, we'll really start in phase 1, we're going to sort of pick a question as a team that we will answer. In phase 2, we'll start to use the information we get to develop new research questions and new experiments. We'll go more into how to interpret the data that we've collected in the previous year, how to make graphs of those data. And then in phase 2 a little bit and starting in phase 3, science is so broad. Most of the research that we'll focus on in this project will be focused on biology and neuroscience because in part, that is where we can generate so many questions just because of the world around us and sort of bring in the skill sets necessary for you to answer questions. So in phase 3, there'll also be opportunities to think about and observing sort of the natural world around you and saying, you know, what can we ask about that? So, and some of that research is incredibly relevant when we think about ending suffering and increasing wellness, because much of what we do in our environment is hurting the community around us. So we could start asking questions about pollution in streams and what are the effects. We could start asking questions about mosquito populations, because mosquitoes transmit disease. We could ask questions about agricultural practices. And we started a little pilot experiment, and some people in this call were involved in this pilot experiment that really set the foundations for how we're doing this program. So in 2017, a group of monastics came together at the Drepung Science Center, and we brainstormed, we thought of lots of questions, we went out and looked at birds and binoculars, and then small groups came up with research projects, and we worked through the process of how you design an experiment, what data you would collect. And so the picture you see here at the bottom is one group. So each group had a name, and this is the panda group. And that panda group came up with a question of, is trash burning actually environmentally harmful? And so we came up with all kinds of ideas about how to test this. And then their experimental plan was to take that soil where trash was burned and soil where it wasn't, and see how it affected plant growth, using plants as a proxy for sort of how it affects living beings, whether they're plants or animals. And that is really sort of the kind of tool set we want to give you. And then we also want to give you the skills to help sort of carry those projects forward and become sort of more and more independent along the way. So you'll develop independent research projects building on cognitive neuroscience or in other fields. And then ultimately, by the end of phase 3, we hope that we'll also sort of develop scientific presentation skills. How do you present that research? Because one thing that was brought up in this comparison of Buddhism and science is that science is a very public domain, right? That knowledge has to get out to the community to affect change and to lead to more science and more questions being asked. And so we'll go through sort of how that process works as well.
So I think one of the themes that we just want to close on for today is, His Holiness has really highlighted how important the conversation is between science and Buddhism. He's very invested in training in science for monastics. And we are, I think, feel very privileged and honored to be facilitating that and helping that. But I'd also like to emphasize that science needs what Buddhism has to offer as much as maybe we can help Buddhism, in the sense of the Dalai Lama's goal for training in science, is that this is really an exciting two-way conversation at this point. There's been, and I'd like to make 2 points. One is, I think ethics is really important in science. And I think that the spirit of science sometimes is pure curiosity, but the world really needs a good ethical model, and science can have big effects on people's lives. And so I think, we really are looking for guidance on ethics from Buddhism and compassion and the focus of well-being. But also there's been a lot of research on meditation and contemplative approaches from a Western science perspective. And I think we're very invested in having, instead of us coming and studying, meditators or monastics, we're interested in your own questions and having you do your own research and being able to investigate your own perspectives. And so really I see this as, and I think we see this as a rich conversation that goes both ways. Science can benefit a lot from the ethics and compassion that Buddhism provides. And perhaps we can help in your own training to help you investigate questions that are of interest to you scientifically and that are in alignment with the Buddhist mission of compassion, well-being, and for the service of all. So it's just been such a privilege to go over this content with you today. And I think I speak for myself, but maybe Nicole as well, when I say I always learn more than in these conversations than I give. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And again, please reach out if who, we have people sort of from different backgrounds on this call, different levels of science. Some people are just becoming teachers in the program. And if you're like, oh, I would love to come up with something, some kind of experiment or something we can do now, or I have this idea, we would be delighted to help from afar until we can be together.
Yeah, just a final thought on that is, COVID is complex and it's complicated all of our plans for the sustainability phase, but we're really here if you want to begin any projects during this period of time while we're waiting for COVID to release its grip on the world. Our hope is that we'll be there next winter, December, for the sustainability phase research training program. A vaccine development suggests that may be a possibility. But during the meantime, if you want to start research projects, if you want to have conversations about research, if you want to get things going, just email us and we'd love to talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robin and Nicole, for this wonderful session. And also thank you everyone from India who participated in this session. And thanks to our faculty and staff who also joined for this session. Thank you and have a good night all in India and have a good day in the United States.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.